You don't belong here. Jasmine Carter had just been told to stand up, to leave her first-class seat, even though her name was printed right there on the ticket. Before we continue, hit that like button and subscribe because what you're about to hear will leave you absolutely speechless. The flight attendant's smile wasn't kindness, it was a blade dressed up as customer service. And as the businessman in the navy suit smirked behind her, Jasmine felt every pair of eyes in the cabin pierce her skin. Phones came out. Someone whispered, "She doesn't belong here." Another muttered, "Probably a mistake." The humiliation hit her chest like turbulence, sharp, unexpected, impossible to steady. She rose slowly, clutching her bag like it was the last piece of dignity she had left. The attendant gestured toward Coach like she was escorting Jasmine out of a courtroom, not an airplane. As Jasmine stepped into the narrow aisle, a child tugged her mother's sleeve and asked, "Mommy, why is that lady in trouble?" The mother hushed the child. Jasmine's throat burned. Trouble? She wasn't in trouble. She had paid for this. But in this space, in first class, a young black woman could be branded guilty without a word of defense. And then the twist. 15 minutes later, as Jasmine sat silently at the gate with her carry-on at her feet, the doors slid open. Out walked Angela Carter. Tailored black suit. Designer heels clicking against the floor like a gavel. Calm, commanding presence. This wasn't just another passenger, this was Jasmine's mother. And more than that, the CEO of a Fortune 500 company. The same company whose slogan read, "Experience without compromise." Now pause. If you were sitting there watching a young black woman be forced out of first class like she didn't matter, and then saw her mother walk in radiating power most people only dream of, what would you expect to happen next? Because what followed nearly destroyed the airline's reputation. The story began hours earlier at Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson Airport. The usual chaos swirled around the gate. Families juggling strollers, flight attendants rushing with clipboards, businessmen tapping away on laptops. Jasmine stood among them, clutching her boarding pass so tightly the paper bent at the corners. She was 25, a college graduate finally traveling for work in the kind of style she had only imagined. Her heart raced, not with fear but with pride. This was her first time in first class. When the boarding call echoed over the PA system, she walked down the jet bridge with her shoulders squared, ticket ready. At the cabin door, the attendant greeted her with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Jasmine brushed it off, stepping into the wide, carpeted aisle of first class. The leather seats gleamed under the soft lights. Passengers lifted their heads, some polite, others scanning her like a stranger in the wrong neighborhood. Jasmine slipped into her seat, row 2 by the window. Relief flooded her chest, she had made it. But moments later, she noticed the businessman across the aisle leaning toward the attendant, whispering something. Their eyes cut toward her. The attendant returned, her voice sugar-coated but her body language cold. "Ma'am, there's been a mistake. This seat isn't yours." Jasmine's brow furrowed. She showed her boarding pass, her name bold and clear. The attendant's tone hardened. "You'll need to step into coach. Now." Her chest tightened. She knew this wasn't a mistake. She knew what this was. Yet, surrounded by stares and recording phones, she stood. Every step down that aisle felt like a trial, and every passenger was the jury. But what none of them knew was that the real verdict hadn't even begun. Because Angela Carter, Jasmine's mother, had just walked into the terminal. And by the time she reached that gate, silence would fall like a curtain. Jasmine sat stiff in the molded plastic chair at the gate, her boarding pass still clutched between her fingers like evidence in a trial no one else cared about. Her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, but she forced her face still. She would not give them the tears they were waiting to see. Around her, travelers kept moving, rolling suitcases, balancing coffee cups, pretending not to notice her, yet sneaking side glances all the same. The hum of the intercom filled the air, but Jasmine only heard the echo of the attendant's words. "This seat isn't yours." She replayed it again and again, searching for a logic that didn't sting. But there was none. She had done everything right. Booked early, paid in full, checked in without issue. And still, in front of everyone, her presence in first class had been treated like a violation of operational necessity. A group of college kids at the corner snickered, nudging each other as they scrolled through a phone. Was it her they were laughing at? Jasmine's stomach twisted. She imagined her face already floating across social media under a caption she couldn't control. Random passenger removed for seating mistake. They would strip her name, her dignity, her story, and leave only the image. A young black woman walking the aisle like an intruder. But then a thought cut through her humiliation, sharp, sobering. What if it wasn't random? What if the man in the navy suit hadn't just whispered about a mistake, but something else? Discretion. Experience. Words airlines used to justify decisions they never had to explain. Jasmine knew corporate language. She grew up hearing her mother deconstruct it around the dinner table. How experience often meant privilege, how discretion often meant bias. And here it was playing out in real time. She shifted in her seat, forcing her shoulders back. Around her, the atmosphere thickened. A businessman nearby kept stealing looks over his newspaper, as if expecting her to protest. An older woman across the aisle leaned forward, whispering to her husband, maybe she used someone else's ticket. Each murmur was a pinprick, each stare a silent verdict. Jasmine opened her mouth, ready to say something, to demand that someone acknowledge the truth she felt in her bones. But before the words could leave her lips, the terminal doors slid open with a sharp hiss. Heels clicked against the floor, deliberate, unhurried, commanding. Every head turned. Jasmine's heart stuttered as her mother's figure emerged in the doorway, framed by the sterile airport light. Angela Carter. Composed. A storm disguised in a tailored black suit. And in that moment, Jasmine realized the humiliation she thought was the end of her story was only the beginning. Jasmine stood frozen in the aisle, her boarding pass still warm in her hand. The attendant's voice had been sweet on the surface, but sharp underneath, like honey laced with vinegar. "Coach is waiting for you, ma'am." That word ma'am felt less like respect and more like a warning. Passengers shifted in their seats. Some avoided her eyes, others tilted their phones higher, recording every second of her shame. Her throat burned. She wanted to argue, to demand the dignity of the seat she had paid for, but her body betrayed her. Her legs moved before her mouth could. One step, then another. Each footfall echoed like a drumbeat in the quiet cabin. First class had gone silent, except for the faint hum of engines. It wasn't just a walk to coach. It was a walk through judgment. And here's the thing. It wasn't the demotion from row 2 to row 22 that crushed her. It was the whispers. A woman in pearls leaned to her husband. Maybe she used someone else's ticket. A man near the window smirked and muttered, "Knew it." These weren't just comments. They were verdicts, delivered before she had even sat down. Now imagine that. You have proof in your hand, your name printed on it, and still, people don't believe you belong. Have you ever been judged before even opening your mouth? Jasmine felt it in her chest like a weight pressing down. When she finally reached coach, she slipped into a narrow seat by the window, her bag pressed against her knees. The air smelled different back here, stuffier, crowded. The first-class door shut behind her like a vault, locking out the truth. She sat there, silent, cheeks burning, replaying the scene in her head. Over and over, one thought looped. Why me? Why now? But something inside her whispered, this wasn't random. That word, mistake. The way the attendant had stretched it, the way the man in the navy suit had glanced at her, it didn't feel like an accident. It felt like a decision. An operational necessity, as the airlines like to call it. Only this time, the operation was keeping her out of sight. And that's when the real twist began to take shape. Because while Jasmine sat in silence, fighting back tears, the automatic doors at the gate opened again. Someone was coming. Someone who would change everything. Jasmine sank into her cramped coach seat, knees brushing the tray table in front of her. The smell of reheated food lingered in the air, mixing with cheap perfume and the faint sting of disinfectant. She clutched her bag tighter, still replaying the humiliation of being marched out of first class under the gaze of strangers who didn't know her name but already thought they knew her story. A man across the aisle leaned toward his companion, voice just loud enough to travel. Told you she couldn't afford that seat. Probably a mix-up with standby. His companion chuckled, shaking his head. Jasmine's ears burned. She wanted to disappear, but the whispers kept circling, like bees looking for somewhere to sting. A flight attendant passed by, eyes skimming over her as if she wasn't there, then stopped abruptly. "Miss, your bag has to go under the seat. Coach rules." The way she said it, clipped, sharp, deliberate, wasn't about policy. It was about putting Jasmine in her place. Jasmine swallowed hard, sliding her tote beneath the seat. She forced her face blank, but inside, her chest tightened. Every small gesture felt like proof. They wanted her invisible. Minutes later, turbulence rattled the cabin. A white woman in the window seat beside Jasmine clutched the armrest, glancing at Jasmine before muttering under her breath, "Of all the luck, stuck back here next to." She didn't finish, but she didn't need to. Jasmine heard the weight of the pause, felt it press down like a stone. Her heart raced. She thought about her boarding pass still tucked in her pocket, proof she'd been meant to sit up front. Proof that none of this should be happening. She thought about her mom still boarding somewhere at the gate, completely unaware. And then, the flight attendant returned, bending close enough that Jasmine could smell the mint on her breath. For everyone's comfort, she whispered, maybe keep your voice down during the flight. Jasmine hadn't even spoken. The attendant straightened, smiled falsely at the row and walked away. The man across the aisle smirked. The woman by the window exhaled with relief. Jasmine sat frozen, her throat aching, her dignity chipped away one insult at a time. But then she noticed something. 2 rows ahead, a passenger held a phone tilted toward her seat, the red light of the camera glowing faintly. Someone was recording. The question wasn't if the world would see what was happening. The question was, who was holding that phone, and why? The cabin lights dimmed, but Jasmine couldn't relax. Her palms were still clammy, her heart still beating like a drum against her ribs. She glanced toward the front where the curtain to first class hung shut, separating her from the seat she'd rightfully paid for. The thin fabric felt heavier than steel, a barrier built from policy and prejudice. Just when she thought the worst was over, another flight attendant appeared. Clipboard in hand, voice coated with false courtesy. Miss Carter? We need to do a quick verification check. Standard procedure. Jasmine blinked. Verification of what? Your boarding document. It's random. Operational necessity. The words landed cold, rehearsed. She pulled out her ticket again, her fingers trembling, and handed it over. The attendant's eyes flicked over the paper, then over Jasmine, then back to the paper, like she was hunting for a reason to call it invalid. Passengers nearby leaned in, watching, waiting for a show. After a long pause, the attendant handed it back, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. All set. Thank you for your discretion. And just like that, she walked away, leaving whispers in her wake. Jasmine felt the sting. Why her? Why now? Nobody else in her row had been checked. She scanned the cabin. The man across the aisle smirked again, as if the whole thing confirmed what he already believed. Moments later, another announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, please prepare for beverage service. The cart rattled down the aisle. When it stopped at Jasmine's row, the attendant barely glanced at her. Water? Jasmine asked softly. The reply came curt. We're out. You'll have to wait. Then, without missing a beat, she turned and offered the man across the aisle a full can of sparkling water with lemon. Jasmine froze, anger bubbling beneath her skin. This wasn't about water. This was about power. About who deserved comfort, and who didn't. She pressed her lips together, fighting back the urge to argue. But then a voice behind her whispered low and sharp, Don't bother. They're trying to make you snap. Jasmine turned, startled, but the speaker leaned back into the shadows before she could see their face. Her chest tightened. Someone else saw it. Someone else understood. But who was it? And why warn her now? The air inside the cabin grew heavier, like the oxygen itself was rationed out as part of some operational necessity. Jasmine tried to keep her shoulders straight, but every glance reminded her she wasn't just a passenger anymore. She was under inspection. The same attendant who had forced her out earlier now returned, voice dipped in syrup but eyes sharp as glass. For your discretion, Miss Carter, we'll need you to remain seated until further notice. Remain seated? Others in her row were moving freely, stretching, reaching into overhead bins. Nobody stopped them. Nobody watched them. But for Jasmine, the rules shifted with every breath. She looked down at her phone, trying to distract herself, but instantly felt the weight of 2 stares, one from the smirking man across the aisle, the other from the uniformed attendant by the galley, arms folded, gaze locked on her like she was hiding contraband. When the beverage cart came again, the attendant paused just long enough to make it awkward. Anything else you'd like to request? The question was loaded like a trap. Jasmine shook her head, refusing to give them another excuse. A whisper drifted from 2 rows back. Why don't they just leave her alone? A woman's voice, hushed, almost scared. Jasmine caught it, but the crew pretended not to. Pretended as if silence was the safest path. Minutes crawled. Every rustle of her bag drew eyes. Every sigh seemed louder than the engine's roar. It wasn't a seat anymore, it was a stage, and she'd been cast as the problem. Then came the strangest part. A man in a gray blazer, who hadn't spoken the entire flight, suddenly leaned forward and murmured something to the flight attendant. She nodded, jotted notes on her clipboard, and glanced back at Jasmine. Notes? About what? Jasmine's chest tightened. This wasn't customer service. This was record-keeping. Her experience wasn't being logged as a paying passenger, it was being documented like a case file. Her fingers clenched around the armrest. If they were writing her into a report, what would it say? Disruptive? Uncooperative? All she had done was sit in a seat she bought. And then, without warning, the cabin speakers cracked to life. The captain's voice boomed, "Miss Carter, please remain in your seat. Crew will be with you shortly." The entire plane turned toward her. Every eye, every phone camera. She froze, heartbeat in her ears, as a terrible thought slammed into her. What exactly were they about to do to her, and why was the captain himself involved? The captain's voice still echoed in Jasmine's head. Her name, called out like an announcement of guilt. Every eye in the cabin was fixed on her, not as a fellow traveler but as a spectacle. The aisle parted as two attendants approached, their smiles polished but their tone sharp enough to cut. "Miss Carter," one began, "for your safety and the experience of all passengers, we'll need to conduct a compliance check." Compliance check. The phrase landed heavy. Nobody else had been asked to comply. Nobody else had been singled out as a disruption. Yet here she was, treated like a suspect in a crime she hadn't committed. "Please remain calm," the other attendant added, her hand hovering just inches from Jasmine's armrest, not touching but close enough to signal authority. The man across the aisle leaned back with satisfaction, like this was the show he had been waiting for. Jasmine tried to steady her breathing. She pulled out her boarding pass again, laid it flat, and whispered, "This is my seat." Her voice trembled but carried a steel edge beneath it. The attendants exchanged a glance. One scribbled notes on that same clipboard, muttering, "Passenger non-compliant." Jasmine's chest tightened. Non-compliant? She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't refused any request. But now her record told another story, a story crafted against her. A passenger 2 rose up, spoke out, voice cracking, "She hasn't done anything wrong." But silence swallowed his words as quickly as they came. No one else dared repeat them. Then the first attendant crouched slightly, lowering her voice but not her tone. "We can handle this quietly, Miss Carter. Or we can escalate. It's your choice." Quietly. Escalate. The words dripped with threat, disguised as discretion. Jasmine's pulse pounded. She felt trapped. If she resisted, she'd be branded defiant. If she complied, her humiliation deepened. Either way, the cabin had already judged her. Phones hovered midair, recording every second. And then came the final blow. The intercom chimed again. "Cabin crew, please prepare a report for ground security upon landing." The words froze Jasmine's blood. Ground security. They weren't just humiliating her in front of strangers. They were preparing to hand her over as if she were dangerous. The attendant stepped back, giving her just enough space to breathe but not enough to move. Passengers shifted uneasily, some whispering, others staring openly. Jasmine gripped the armrest, her mind racing. Would she make it off this plane with only shame, or in handcuffs? The cabin air felt heavier than oxygen should. Angela Carter stood at the gate, her presence commanding the kind of silence that made even seasoned travelers shrink back into their seats. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her words were precise, measured, yet each syllable carried the weight of decades spent fighting to be heard in rooms that were never built for women like her. "I'd like to know," she said calmly, "why my daughter was removed from her assigned seat." The flight attendant's smile wavered. "It was a matter of operational necessity, ma'am. Just a random adjustment for the comfort of other passengers." There it was. Those words, operational necessity. Cold, corporate, wrapped in the soft paper of policy. But anyone listening could hear the sharp edge underneath. Angela's eyes narrowed. Random. Adjustment. Comfort. Those words weren't neutral. They were weapons disguised as procedure. Passengers leaned in, pretending not to listen but unable to look away. You could almost feel their thoughts racing. Was it really random? Or was it something else? Jasmine stood behind her mother, still clutching the boarding pass like it was proof of her existence. She didn't speak, but the redness around her eyes told the story. Every glance at that slip of paper was a reminder. She belonged in first class, and yet she had been erased from it in front of dozens of strangers. Angela tilted her head slightly. "Discretion is important," she said, her tone polite but cutting. "But so is accountability. And I am struggling to see either one here." The attendant's posture stiffened. Her training manual hadn't prepared her for this moment. She tried to pivot, repeating lines that sounded safe on paper but brittle in real life. "I assure you, ma'am, the decision wasn't personal. It was just about creating the best experience for everyone on board." Angela's eyes flickered with something dangerous, not rage but clarity. She had heard this before. The same script delivered in boardrooms, at private clubs, and executive lounges. Always framed as experience, always packaged as policy, but always landing on the same target. People like her and now her daughter. But before Angela could press further, a man from row 2 slowly stood. He adjusted his glasses, slid his phone into his jacket pocket and cleared his throat. The hush in the cabin deepened. Some passengers recognized him instantly. Others didn't. But his next words made everyone's pulse quicken. "My name is Ethan Morales," he said, voice steady. "I write for the Washington Post. And I've been recording since the moment your daughter was asked to leave her seat." The air changed. What had been an uncomfortable standoff was now a story, one that would not stay contained within the walls of this airplane. Angela's gaze met the journalist's. A silent understanding passed between them. This was no longer just about one seat, one humiliation, or one flight. This was about to become bigger than anyone imagined. And yet, just as hope began to flicker in Jasmine's chest, a voice crackled over the intercom, a voice that would change everything again. The cabin speakers hissed, then cracked alive with a voice that carried both calmness and threat. It was the captain. "Ladies and gentlemen, we ask for your patience. For operational necessity, we are handling a seating adjustment. Please remain seated." The words landed like a hammer. Operational necessity. The same phrase the flight attendant had already used, now echoed from the cockpit as if policy itself had been weaponized. A chill spread across first class. Passengers glanced at each other, at Jasmine, at Angela. Nobody moved, but the silence spoke volumes. Angela lifted her chin, her expression unchanged, but inside she recognized the tactic. Wrap injustice in official language and suddenly it looked clean, professional, unavoidable. Discretion disguised as law. Experience marketed as fairness. Random adjustments presented as order. She had seen this script in boardrooms where decisions about billions were cloaked in those same words. Jasmine shrank back slightly, the sound of the captain's voice pressing down on her chest. She felt invisible again, as if the intercom itself had erased her from existence. But Angela leaned forward, her voice measured, aimed at the nearest attendant. "So the captain is now confirming this was deliberate?" The attendant's face flushed. "Ma'am, we don't want to escalate." Angela cut her off softly. "Escalate? You've already humiliated my daughter in front of a cabin full of witnesses. The escalation didn't start with me." Gasps rippled across the aisle. Some passengers looked away, pretending to scroll their phones. Others couldn't stop staring. And in row 2, Ethan Morales, the journalist, simply adjusted his phone angle. Every word, every breath was still being captured. But here was the dangerous part. The captain's announcement had shifted the balance. Before, it was one crew member's questionable action. Now, the full weight of the airline, its authority, its discretion, seemed to stand against Angela and Jasmine. What chance did one mother and daughter have against an entire corporate system midair? Angela felt the trap tightening, yet she refused to flinch. She knew the difference between rules meant to keep passengers safe and rules twisted to keep certain passengers in their place. And the more official the language sounded, the more suspicious it became. The journalist leaned closer, voice low but clear enough to carry, "Mrs. Carter, if the captain is doubling down, this isn't just a mistake anymore. It's policy." That single word, policy, sliced through the air like broken glass. Angela's eyes swept the cabin, pausing on each face that had watched Jasmine's walk of shame earlier. Her voice dropped lower but sharper. "Then we're all witnesses, aren't we? Witnesses to how easily dignity can be stripped away when it's hidden behind so-called discretion." Before anyone could respond, the intercom hissed again. This time the voice was colder. "Mrs. Carter, this is the captain speaking directly. If you cannot comply, we may need to remove you from this aircraft." The cabin froze. And in that moment, one terrifying thought echoed in everyone's mind. Would they really eject a Fortune 500 CO, just to cover up what they had done to her daughter? For a long moment, nobody moved. The captain's threat still hung in the air like smoke after a fire. Angela sat tall, her hands folded neatly on her lap, her silence louder than any argument. Jasmine's eyes brimmed, but she bit her lip, refusing to let them see her cry. Then it started. A voice from row 4. A woman with silver hair and pearls around her neck. "The crew's just doing their job," she said flatly. "If she wasn't supposed to be here, then she wasn't supposed to be here." The words stung Jasmine, but before she could sink deeper, another voice rose. A young black man in a gray hoodie sitting across the aisle leaned forward. "No," he said firmly. "I saw her ticket. She had every right to that seat." Gasp. Shuffling. Now the silence was cracking wide open. The journalist tilted his phone just slightly, capturing faces, voices, tension. He didn't need to add commentary, the story was writing itself. Angela turned to the pearl-wearing woman, her tone still calm. So you're comfortable with a young black woman being humiliated for following the rules? You think that's just doing a job? The woman bristled but said nothing more. That was when a man in the navy suit, the very one who had whispered to the flight attendant earlier, spoke up. His voice was sharp, meant to slice through the chaos. Look, this is first class. People pay for privacy for experience. It's not the place for disruptions. The word experience, the same word airlines plaster on their brochures, now being used like a weapon to mark who belonged and who didn't. Angela's head tilted. Disruptions? My daughter quietly boarded with a valid ticket. The only disruption was your whisper. The man's jaw tightened. He looked away. But the tide had shifted. Other passengers began murmuring, some defending Jasmine, others mumbling about policy, discretion, and order. The cabin wasn't just divided, it was boiling. Every glance, every side comment, carried the weight of judgment. Jasmine felt the heat of it all pressing down on her. She wasn't just fighting for her seat anymore. She was on trial in a courtroom with no judge, only strangers deciding whether she deserved dignity. And through it all, the intercom stayed silent, the captain listening, waiting, calculating. The journalist finally spoke again, his voice steady, carrying just enough edge to slice through the cabin. So what's it going to be? An airline that hides behind random policies, or a company that admits it humiliated a paying customer because of how she looks? Head snapped toward him. Phones tilted again. This wasn't private anymore. The story was alive, pulsing, leaking into the outside world one recording at a time. Angela leaned forward, locking eyes with the nearest attendant. Tell your captain, if he removes me on camera in front of every witness here. And then, let's see what happens when this video hits the news. The attendant swallowed hard, her lips parting, but before she could answer. The hum of the engines filled the silence, but it wasn't just background noise anymore, it was the sound of something boiling under the surface. Ethan Morales, the Washington Post journalist, held his phone steady, the red recording light glowing like a warning flare. But what no one in first class knew was that Ethan wasn't just recording. He was live. Tens of thousands of viewers had already joined the stream, their comments racing down the screen. Unbelievable. This is straight-up racism. Name the airline. The story had already escaped the cabin walls, spreading through Twitter, TikTok, and Facebook like wildfire. Every minute the audience doubled. Angela Carter sensed the shift before she even knew why. She leaned slightly toward Ethan, her voice low but razor-sharp. You're not just keeping this for later, are you? Ethan didn't flinch. The world is watching already. Her eyes narrowed. That meant the airline wasn't just fighting one family anymore. They were fighting the entire digital crowd, angry and awake in real time. And that crowd didn't forget. The flight attendant's earpiece crackled. She pressed it closer, her expression tightening. Someone on the ground was feeding her instructions, trying to contain what was already uncontainable. Words like discretion and operational necessity floated out of her mouth, but they sounded weaker now, flimsy against the roar of online outrage climbing by the second. Jasmine glanced around nervously. The pearl-wearing woman who had defended the crew was whispering to her seatmate, her cheeks red. The man in the navy suit checked his phone, his confidence cracking as he realized the incident wasn't staying private. Passengers began to murmur louder, their voices mixing with pings of notifications as phones buzzed with breaking news alerts. Angela's voice cut through the noise, steady and chilling. If the captain thought he could hide behind policy, he was wrong. There's no hiding now. The journalist's phone vibrated in his hand. A text flashed across the screen from his editor. Feed is trending. Keep rolling. This could be tomorrow's headline. Angela caught the message reflected in his glasses. She exhaled slowly, almost like she had expected this storm all along. But Jasmine's heart raced. She hadn't signed up for a viral spectacle. She just wanted to sit in her seat, to belong. And now millions of strangers were dissecting her humiliation, second by second. Then the intercom snapped alive again, the captain's voice hard-edged, almost desperate. Mr. Morales, turn off that recording immediately or we will land this aircraft. The cabin gasped. Phones tilted higher. And in that frozen second, a single terrifying thought hit every passenger. Would the airline really bring down a plane just to silence the truth? The tension in the cabin thickened as Angela Carter rose from her seat. Calm, measured, yet impossible to ignore, she spoke with the weight of years spent dismantling excuses that hid behind polished smiles. The crew scrambled. A supervisor was called in, a man with a practiced grin and a voice tuned to sound reasonable. "Ma'am," he began, tilting his head, "this was a matter of protocol. We followed operational necessity. Nothing personal. There it was, the coded language. Discretion. Experience. Operational necessity." Words designed to sound neutral, but Angela heard the undertones as clearly as thunder. She had lived through this script before. Her eyes narrowed slightly, but her voice remained steady. "Protocol? Then explain why my daughter's boarding pass was printed with that exact seat number. Explain why a paying passenger was humiliated in front of strangers instead of quietly reassigned, if this was truly a mistake." The supervisor shifted, pulling at his tie. Around them, passengers leaned closer, pretending not to eavesdrop but unable to look away. A woman in row 3 pressed her lips tight, while the businessman who whispered to the attendant earlier kept his eyes fixed on his laptop screen, tapping nonsense just to avoid her gaze. Angela pressed further, every word deliberate. "You speak of rules, but rules without accountability are weapons. Tell me, whose discretion decided my daughter did not belong in that seat?" The crew member faltered. He repeated the phrase, "It's random, ma'am," as though repetition could make it true. But the word hung in the air like smoke. Random. A word that hid choice behind chance. Angela didn't raise her voice, she didn't need to. Authority radiated from her presence. She dismantled every excuse with precision, each rebuttal sharper than the last. Her hands rested calmly on the armrest, her tone even, but her words left no room for escape. The audience in first class felt the shift. This wasn't just a passenger arguing with staff. This was a power struggle, between a black woman who had climbed to the very top of corporate America, and a system that thought it could brush her aside with policy. The supervisor's smile cracked. His eyes darted toward the cockpit, then back to the attendant, then finally to the rows of passengers who were silently judging every move. He knew this wasn't going away. And just as Angela prepared to deliver her final question, the cabin door clicked open. Someone else had arrived. Someone who could change everything. Angela did not flinch. Her voice was steady, her presence unshakable, as the flight crew stumbled over each word they tried to throw at her. They said it softly at first, the kind of language that pretends to explain but really avoids the truth. It was protocol. It was random. It was an operational necessity. The words floated in the air like corporate perfume, carefully chosen, harmless on the surface, but sharp underneath. Passengers heard them, but only Angela understood their weight. She had built her life learning how those words were used, how they gave cover to decisions that had nothing to do with fairness. She leaned forward, not loud, not aggressive, but surgical with her tone. "Protocol is not an answer. Rules are not an excuse. You had discretion, and you used it against my daughter." The supervisor, called in as backup, forced a smile that twitched at the corners. His tie sat too tight against his throat, his hands restless with a stack of papers he didn't need. "You wanted this to go away. Ma'am, we regret the misunderstanding. These situations are complicated." Angela didn't let him finish. "Complicated? A boarding pass with her name on it is not complicated. A seat that matched that pass is not complicated. What is complicated is your willingness to say the words, misunderstanding, instead of admitting what really happened here." The silence in the cabin was heavy now. A businessman shifted uncomfortably in his chair. A woman in pearls crossed her arms, her jaw set. Even those who had filmed Jasmine's humiliation earlier were frozen, watching a new kind of reckoning unfold. The supervisor tried again, reaching for another layer of polished language. "Ma'am, in our experience, situations like this require flexibility. We train our staff to act quickly to avoid disruption." Angela's eyes narrowed. "Experience? Whose experience? Hers, walking down the aisle with every eye on her, accused of stealing a seat she paid for? Or yours, defending prejudice behind a manual you hope no one will read?" Her words cut through the cabin, precise and undeniable. The excuses one by one collapsed. Every phrase, protocol, random, operational necessity, exposed as nothing more than a shield. And just as the supervisor opened his mouth to try again, the cabin door clicked. Everyone's head turned. Another figure was stepping inside, carrying the weight of the airline's fear with them. Whispers rippled through the cabin like a hidden current. The supervisor who had been sparring with Angela leaned toward the flight attendant, his voice low but not low enough. "We need corporate on the line. Now." 2 more staff members appeared, clipboards in hand, carrying the forced calm of people trained to put out fires but already smelling smoke. Their eyes darted between Angela, seated like a queen refusing to yield, and the journalist, whose camera rested casually on his lap but still recording. It wasn't just about a seat anymore. It was about headlines, lawsuits, shareholders, the kind of storm that could cost careers. Angela knew it, and so did they. Every word spoken now was ammunition, every hesitation a confession. One representative cleared her throat. "Ms. Carter, please understand we're committed to fairness and safety." Angela cut her off with a glance. Not rude. Not loud. Just final. "Fairness? Show me where fairness was when my daughter was marched out in front of strangers. Show me where safety was when your staff decided a paying black woman couldn't sit in a seat she purchased." The words hit harder than any shout could. The room felt smaller, the air tighter. Passengers leaned closer, eyes wide, waiting for the next blow. Some looked guilty. Others looked thrilled to witness history. The staff whispered again. One hissed, "If she goes public, we're finished." Another replied, "It's already public. That man's recording everything." Their panic wasn't hidden anymore. Angela sat calmly, but her silence was a weapon. She let them talk, let their fear bloom in front of the audience. It was power, pure and visible. Then, just when the crew thought the worst was over, Angela leaned forward. Her voice was low, deliberate. "You still don't understand. This isn't about one flight, one seat, or one mistake. This is about a system that humiliates us and hides behind words like random and protocol. I don't fight small battles. I end them." The cabin fell into a deeper hush. Even the engines outside seemed to fade for a moment. The crew stiffened, realizing the stakes had just grown again. But what they didn't know, what none of them knew, was how far Angela was willing to go, and just how much power she carried beyond this cabin. The cabin no longer felt like an airplane. It felt like a courtroom. Angela Carter stood in the aisle, her voice calm but sharp enough to cut steel. "You've already admitted protocol was broken. You've already admitted she had a valid ticket. Now tell me, why was my daughter removed?" The supervisor opened his mouth, closed it, then tried the shield of corporate jargon. "It was a matter of operational necessity, ma'am. A random reassignment." Angela stepped forward, her heels clicking against the floor, every sound echoing in the silence. "Don't insult me with buzzwords. Random has never meant target the black woman first. I've spent 20 years negotiating contracts larger than your airline's quarterly revenue. Do you really want to stand here and tell me this was random?" Murmurs broke out in the cabin. Passengers who had stayed silent began whispering to one another, shifting in their seats. Some shook their heads, others lifted their phones higher, recording every second. The Washington Post journalist leaned forward, pen scratching across his notebook. He had already written the headline in his mind, "Flying While Black, First-Class Humiliation." The story was no longer confined to this aircraft. It was about to travel faster than the plane itself. Angela's eyes never left the crew. "You may not realize this yet, but I know exactly how your chain of command works. One phone call, and this incident reaches not just your base manager but your boardroom. Do you understand the kind of exposure you've invited?" The word exposure hung in the air like smoke. The attendants stiffened. One reached for the intercom but hesitated. Passengers leaned closer, their sympathy shifting toward Jasmine and her mother. The court of public opinion was already turning, and everyone on board could feel it. Angela placed her hand on Jasmine's shoulder, grounding her. "They thought they could humiliate you and walk away. But this is bigger than you. This is bigger than me. This is about what they think they can get away with when no one pushes back." For a moment, silence blanketed the cabin. Then a passenger in row 3 whispered loud enough for others to hear, "She's right." Another murmured, "I've seen this before." It spread like a current, a quiet rebellion against the crew's authority. The journalist lowered his pen and raised his camera instead, catching the moment. The image of a black mother standing tall in first class, flanked by her daughter while an airline squirmed, that was the kind of picture that shook industries. Angela's voice dropped to a razor's edge. "So here's your choice. Fix this now or face me later in court." The crew exchanged panicked looks. The supervisor swallowed hard, his corporate mask slipping. He turned as if waiting for backup that wasn't coming. But just as the tension hit its peak, the PA system chimed. A voice from the cockpit came over the speakers, steady but nervous. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've just received an urgent message from corporate headquarters." And with that, the cabin froze again. The cabin was quiet now, but not the calm kind of quiet. It was the silence that follows a storm, the heavy kind that forces everyone to replay what just happened. Jasmine sat back in her seat, still trembling, but this time it wasn't from humiliation. It was from relief, and from the weight of realizing her mother's presence had shifted the entire balance of power. 15 minutes ago, she had been treated like she didn't belong. Now the same crew that pushed her out of first class couldn't meet her eyes. Angela leaned slightly toward her daughter, her voice low, steady. "You didn't do anything wrong. Remember that." Those words, whispered in the soft hum of the airplane cabin, carried more authority than the captain's announcements. For Jasmine, they were not just comfort, they were armor. But the bigger story wasn't just between mother and daughter. It hung in the air for everyone to feel, the undeniable reality of how quickly perception shifts when power walks through the door. Passengers who had recorded Jasmine's humiliation now watched Angela with a strange mix of respect, fear, and maybe even guilt. The same whispers that once questioned whether Jasmine had really paid were gone, replaced by silence. Discretion, as the airline liked to call it. The flight attendants, cornered by their own choices, began using softer words now: operational necessity, protocol, experience. Each phrase sounded polished, safe, corporate, but everyone knew what it really meant. It meant excuses. It meant covering tracks. It meant pretending the decision had nothing to do with race when, in truth, that was the only thing it had to do with. Angela didn't need to shout to make that point. Her presence alone was enough. Jasmine sat straighter, watching her mother take control of a situation that had once left her powerless. For the first time that day, Jasmine saw the layers of hidden strength it took to walk into spaces that weren't built for women like them. Angela wasn't just defending her daughter. She was exposing the entire structure, the rules, the culture, the bias, brick by brick. And here's where the deeper question lingers. If Jasmine's mom hadn't been a CEO, if she hadn't walked in with that kind of authority and recognition, would the outcome have been different? Would Jasmine still be sitting in coach right now, erased and dismissed? That thought isn't just about this flight. It's about every space where silence protects discrimination. So, let me ask you, if this can happen in the most visible rule-bound place, at 30,000 feet in the air with dozens of witnesses watching, what does it mean for life on the ground where there are no cameras, no journalists, no powerful parents to intervene? This isn't just Jasmine's story. It's a mirror. And the reflection it gives us is uncomfortable, undeniable, and impossible to look away from. Have you ever faced something like this? Tell me in the comments. Your story matters here too, because silence protects the system. But sharing, together, can dismantle it. If this can happen in first class, what does it mean for the world we all share? Subscribe and be part of the movement to call it out.